Emancipation Proclamation, and the guest is Dr. Bobby Lovett, Professor of History at Tennessee State University. Dr. Lovett, in our introductory statement, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation and the entire movement on the part of President Abraham Lincoln to abolish the institution of slavery. But before we get to the Emancipation Proclamation, I'd like for you to give the viewing audience some information relative to the institution of slavery as such in the United States prior to 1861.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haney, for welcoming me to the program. And you are right that slavery in the United States began in 1619. Although slavery had existed on this side of the world, the New World, especially in South America, since about 1513. And by 1860, there are approximately 3.8 million slaves living in the United States. So slavery grew fairly rapidly. Although only about 500,000 Africans were actually imported into the British 13 colonies or the United States. And from that 500,000 imports, the slave population multiplied to nearly 4 million by the time the Civil War came about. When the Civil War came about, approximately 95% of all blacks lived in the South and in slavery. However, about 10%, half living in the North and half living in the South, were free blacks who were freed through various kinds of methods. But slavery had grew because of the technological revolution in 1800, because of the expansion of land in the United States after 1800, and as a result of the desire to exploit that land and its resources, especially growing cotton and other cash crops like tobacco and rice and indigo, there was a tendency to encourage the reproduction of slaves. As well, the Constitution of the United States sanctioned slavery. It provided that any slaves brought into the country, you had to pay a tax on those slaves, so it did recognize slavery. It provided no imports after 1808, but it also restricted the southern states as far as representatives in the House of Congress and the Representatives' House of Congress to counting no more than 2/3 of those slaves and determining how many representatives they would have in Congress. So it was sanctioned throughout our particular society, and as a result, slavery grew and it was protected by the federal Constitution until that conflict was resolved by the Civil War of 1861.
Now, what about the entire movement to abolish the institution of slavery? When does this movement first appear as a political movement, and why at that point?
That's a very good question, and the real abolitionist movement starts 2 generations before the Civil War. It actually starts during the American Revolutionary War. That war, with its precepts of liberty and equality and fraternity of man, influenced a lot of people to think about the evils of human bondage. And as a result of that, many people became anti-slavery during the American Revolutionary War. For example, the first anti-slavery society was started in Philadelphia in 1876, the first real year of the war, by the American Quakers Society. And in 1780, Massachusetts became the first state to outright abolish slavery. And by 1800, all of the northern states have passed legislative acts to gradually do away with the institution of slavery, so that by 1820, the nation is truly half slave and half free. The northern states, as a consequence of the revolution, have gotten rid of the institution of slavery, but the southern states have held on to it because they are predominantly an agricultural society. And then in the 1830s, Northerners began to organize to get rid of slavery throughout the country, the so-called abolitionists. And as a result of those people becoming fanatical about their movement, it causes a rift between the North and the South, not only politically but also religiously, because in 1845, for example, the Methodist Church splits over the question of slavery. And in 1846, the Baptist Church splits over the question of slavery. And by 1855, the major national conventions of the churches have split over that question. So the Civil War was first fought in the churches rather than fought on the battlefield. And then, of course, other particular things come about, the compromises of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, where Northerners tried to compromise about where slavery would exist and where it would not exist. And those compromises didn't work, and as a result, you know, bloodshed resulted in 1861.
So what you're saying, Doctor, is that the institution of slavery was a very divisive kind of issue in the American body politics from about 1830 down through 1860, even before the war.
It was a divisive issue even before that. Even if you look at the Constitutional Convention that wrote the American Constitution of 1787, some of the most heated debates were over the question of slavery. Would the new nation permit slavery or would it not permit slavery? It did permit it, but under certain particular guidelines, like the 2/3 compromise, the 3/5 compromise, the 1808 prohibition against bringing any more slaves into the country after that particular day. So if you look at the very beginning of our country, slavery was a very heated issue, and it divided the North and South. And so,
Doctor, where does Abraham Lincoln fit into the scenario?
well, Lincoln was, in my opinion, a facilitator of what had been going on for 2 generations already, and that was the country was moving toward the abolition of the institution of slavery. However, Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, which was formed in 1854, as a result of those people in the North who were against slavery, abolitionists, people who did not want slavery to extend into any more of the free lands, they called themselves the Free Soil Party. Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs all formed a coalition in 1854 and decided to call it the National Republican Party. And that party was basically anti-slavery. And when they finally won an election just 6 years after their existence with Abraham Lincoln as a standard bearer, the South was upset because they knew that this party, regardless of who the head of it was committed to the abolition of the institution of slavery. Lincoln had to carry out the commitment of that party to abolish the institution of slavery. If he did not, the coalition would have fell apart, you see, would have fallen apart. And as a result, the Republican Party might not have existed after 1861.
So Lincoln sort of served as the spearhead. The Republican Party served as a spearhead, but
Lincoln
in reality,
was only carrying out the platform of the party. We really don't know as historians today whether Mr. Lincoln was really, truly an abolitionist. Most likely he was not, but he really didn't have a say about it one way or the other, but his party was committed to it. And if he had not carried out that plank of the party platform, the Free Soil Party members, and especially the Abolitionist Party members, would have withdrawn from that party, and the party would have collapsed. So Mr. Lincoln proclaimed the Emancipation Proclamation for 2 reasons, for military reasons and for political reasons.
Very well. Doctor, we're going to have to break here, and we want to thank you for coming by and giving us some information relative to the part played by the institution of slavery in American history, as well as the part played by President Abraham Lincoln. And of course, we're going to continue our discussion in this next segment, where we will talk about other aspects of Abraham Lincoln, and we will see him from perhaps other points of view. We're going to have to take a commercial break at this moment.